All right, so yeah, as I mentioned, today's session is focused on cloud security monitoring and analytics with Sumo Logic. I'm going to breeze through the slides as sort of as rapidly as I can so that we can get to the demo itself, and I'll be live in the Sumo Logic environment, kind of with live data where we can actually show you some examples of kind of what's been discussed in the slide, and just after a little bit of level setting initially. So with that, I'll kind of dive in. Feel free to ask questions throughout, pop in a chat or the Q&A section, and just add any questions you might have, and then we can kick. If it's something I can answer in the scope of that slide or that part of the demo, I'm happy to do it, or we can save it to the end if it's kind of a broader question. So just a quick overview of the Sumo Logic security intelligence solutions. So the kind of the items on the left really are the continuous intelligence platform, the core platform of Sumo Logic, which is really kind of the log analytics and metrics and tracing and various aspects that are built into that platform. And that's where I'll be showing the demo. Audit and compliance will have, we had actually a webinar probably about close to a year ago now, actually, and we'll be kind of bringing that back into the fold. Really, it was focused at the time on PCI, but there are kind of broader compliance considerations as well. Today's session, of course, focused on cloud security monitoring and analytics. So really about the monitoring, detection, searching, investigation of security incidents. And then Cloud SIM and Cloud SOAR, which will be addressed in the upcoming webinars throughout this week or even in future months for that matter, which really kind of get into the, dive that one extra step deeper into kind of the investigation aspect, the threat detection component, as well as, with Cloud SOAR, it gets into really the automation aspect of being able to build these repeatable playbooks and really improve SOC efficiency in the process. So just a quick overview of the platform, as I mentioned, which is, at the moment, over 2,100 customers are utilizing 27 exabytes of data being scanned monthly. As far as kind of the value piece, I mean, we'll kind of show not tell, so I don't feel the need to call out each of these bullets necessarily, but I do want to just mention, in light of the previous slide, that in terms of the cloud economics kind of consumption model or credits-based pricing model, there's really a lot of flexibility in terms of if you want to utilize different solutions within the security intelligence portfolio, you do have that option to kind of jump between various aspects of them based on kind of what your seasonal requirements are as a team, et cetera. So yeah, so we'll focus on the second column for today. Kind of some of the challenges that we commonly see with customers is really that they are really trying to look for a platform that is very much cloud native as well as cloud agnostic, kind of a hybrid of those two concepts, and really allows for the diverse array of ingest of firewall, database, identity access, CDN data. So a lot of platforms just don't have kind of that same breadth, whereas Sumo Logic is able to bring in all of those various types, which we'll show in the next slide as well, in kind of a more graphic format. Increased visibility, really, I mean, in the broadest sense, you're really going to be able to both monitor, analyze cloud and on-premise data, and really increase the scope of view of what those threats are going to be able to, which types of threats are going to be able to be tracked. And then security focused analytics. I mean, a lot of platforms, of course, offer analytics in many different sort of types or avenues or with in various forms. Security focused analytics, though, is not always on the table. It's often more of a vanilla format that's kind of needing to be tuned according to those requirements. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a more visual look. I mean, the data source piece we kind of mentioned, and then security monitoring and security analytics, we'll get into kind of what the difference is or even what the intersections are. But essentially, security monitoring is more of the overview. Security analytics is where you can get more specific and granular and really dig into specific queries. And then kind of the granularity of devices, IPs, networks, databases, especially when you go into a security analytics kind of focused use case, the ability to actually pivot out on a specific IP or network can be a really valuable way to better understand what's happening within your environment. So this is the this is the platform. I mean, I'll be showing you in a more interactive format, but this gives you a quick snapshot of what to expect. It's really going to be focused around process investigation. And there is the ability as well to respond to security incidents. I mean, for sure, response is probably more, in some ways, better suited for SOAR, right? Because it's literally written into the definition of that particular product. But in a lot of ways, that's something you can tackle within the platform as well. So we have a lot of Slack webhooks or email webhooks that allow for the response or the quarantining of hosts just within Slack. So if you get an email alert, or if it triggers to your Slack webhook, that's where you can really act on that accordingly. Additionally, I mean, the investigation piece is really going to be a big focal point as you start with that kind of broader security monitoring overview, and you go more detailed into security analytics. That's where you're going to really be able to dig in. These are a couple of supporting features that I'll kind of just show within the demo, but I just want to call them out here on the slide. When I talk about prioritizing threats, it's really about generating those actionable security insights that allow you to leverage all of that data that we're describing, and also really surface the most relevant insights in the process. So, it's challenging sometimes without that sort of prioritization of those threats to really sift through what all is happening. So via outliers, et cetera, we really allow you to kind of better understand the broader piece in order to really dig in deeper. When you go in, as I said, deeper investigations, right? So when you're going in a lot deeper, a lot of the time what you're going to want to do is kind of go into the query level and better assess what's happening there. Like, this is showing just a query is nothing at this point. It's not a view within a dashboard, although you can save it down as a panel into a dashboard. But this query is really allowing you to tune based on what your requirements are into like the user level, or pivot out into the various thresholds of what the right type of outlier is, et cetera. As far as accelerating response, this is something we'll touch on just here and not as much in the demo, but I just do want to call it out that in addition to kind of the email alerts or the Slack webhooks that I mentioned, there's also, and here we're looking at a dashboard itself that's kind of like can act as a starting point in order to then understand more about what needs to be responded to, and then you can look at how to actually accelerate those incident response times. And then user level activity. So again, as I touched on this earlier slide, we can pivot out into various levels of granularity of device, IP, network, database. You can see on the right side. So this is where we're looking at what does it look like to really get into the query dashboard or alert that can really pinpoint those unexpected anomalies that are tied back to an individual user. So this is kind of a sampling of the security monitoring dashboards that might be relevant. Some of these are in the app catalog, and some are more of just a custom one-off, but it really depends on what you're looking to achieve. Professional services teams, our professional service team here at Sumo can really work with you also to kind of like either build something custom for like a new kind of data source that isn't typically seen within our customer base, or you can even tune existing app catalog content based on what your requirements are. So we'll actually come back to kind of the thank you and the additional resources, but we do have these kind of various resources that I think can be helpful if you want to reference that throughout the scope of the demo. But what I'll do here is I'll just jump straight into the demo environment. So I'm going to start actually with Palo Alto. So, well, let me give actually a quick lay of the land here. So sort of this is the continuous intelligence platform within administration, managed data, app catalog. So within managed data, you have the option to set up your collection here, and then also tune like logs, metrics, monitoring within that. App catalog, here's where we're going to start with Palo Alto. And this is available. It's specifically the second piece you can see based on the sort of the eyeball icon is indicating cloud security monitoring and analytics. So that's where we're going to start. But you also have the ability to kind of pivot out based on if you're like an AWS customer, or if you have sort of like security specific, like cloud security monitoring and analytics specific use cases, which is what we're talking about today. But you may also want to pivot out and say, I want to use Google Cloud Platform dashboards and then kind of tune them more to security use cases. So it really just depends on kind of what you're looking to achieve. Within each of these, you also have the ability to share out, and like there's a very collaborative aspect to all this where you can decide what like the permissions levels are for each of these, and then I can assign this to either a broader group of users or a specific user. So if I want to send it to Paul, or if I want to set it to like all account executives have access for viewing, that's definitely an option that you have. Yeah, so let me just, I'll shift out the left panel so we can just left column so we can just focus on the dashboards themselves. So, yeah, and feel free to click on, we just added in the chat kind of the resources that are available. So I think that will be a helpful way to kind of dig in from there. So yeah, so we'll start with security monitoring within Palo Alto Networks data in particular. So as you can see here, this is kind of the broad strokes overview of how you can kind of track or see allowed traffic over time. And what it's interesting because I think anytime we look at firewall data or network data, it's often like this, where it's very much in lockstep between allowed traffic and denied traffic. So even just that differential between the two could be really interesting to look at. But in this case, we see kind of some similarities across the board of like a kind of gradual upslope. This most recent downtick is basically just because it's still collecting the data for the past sort of 5 minutes or so. But if I click out, actually I'll save search queries for a moment. We'll see, we can see here like a broader overview, and we can see the top 10 over most likely hosts to occur. Then if we pivot out into, well, a couple interesting things to look at here so this is more of a, again, we're staying at kind of the security monitoring overview level. But this is, because this is new dashboards, it's actually able to integrate in logs as well as metrics and a few new features, including honeycomb. So a little bit different visual look. And we actually hover over and we see a lot of consistency of events by destination IP. But then if we look more closely at the sort of the, destination IP of 132.237, we see there's a higher occurrence, and that's why it's occurring is kind of that darker blue there. And that's an indicator that it may be something you want to dig in deeper. We also see geolocation of events, event details by frequency being shown. So just a little bit different angle, a little bit different way of looking at things. And giving a little bit more visual sense. You can see as it gets more detailed, the honeycomb still can be a really valuable way to like pick out unexpected behavior for a destination IP. If we look at kind of user level activity, it's an interesting example of security analytics, where here we're looking at identity and access data, and we see kind of the events by severity over time, and we see that, in this case, as we might expect, info data is kind of the largest occurrence of events that are occurring within this particular panel. And then we can see that below that, we have debug, we have error, we have warn, and most likely, error is going to be something we'd want to sort of pivot out on. And that's where we can actually go into the query and just look at, say, okay, what is occurring? And we can say, based on these various types of severity, you do have the option to kind of like tune this query accordingly, or say, okay, maybe it's not as interesting to look at all event types, and then you can start to actually remove the debug, for example. So I think it's also helpful to call out in the scope of this query that, if we're getting really into the details, we can look at sort of like a user level. So we see Tony Farrow. It's called out here as an example. And there's a message, and you can look at the raw message, which in this case is in JSON. So it's kind of already very visually parsable, very easy to understand. But it's also broken out at the field level, which I think can be really helpful to kind of better understand. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of like almost to flip it around. It's like if you start with a query, that's going to give you the really deep detail, and then you can start to piece together your own custom dashboards in order to better assess what's really going on in that particular environment. But this is taking a little bit more of an out-of-the-box approach of saying this is what it looks like just straight out the gates. I think it's helpful to call out, when we get into the specifics of user level activity, what does that actually, look like? In this case, I can actually call out specific names here. So I can take a look, or we can do it in reverse and say what is sort of the most common event by user. And here we see Saran is sort of has the most reoccurring data. So we can just pivot out and look at only Saran's data. We'll let that load for a second. And what we learned through that is that the majority of Saran's logins are occurring within sort of the Bay Area or extended Bay Area. So we don't see any unexpected behavior. In fact, we can go to full screen here. And that's good. I mean, I think it's all in line with what we'd anticipate. If we saw some data occurring in Albany or in Harrisburg, then maybe not a huge alarm, just something to dig into, or even run sort of like what we call a Superman query, which is going to tell you essentially, whether or not that's expected behavior that's, or whether or not, it's a login from Zurich, Switzerland within 10 seconds of a login from New York, New York. That's probably an indicator that there's unexpected behavior, and there really shouldn't be two different logins from that far apart within the world. So I think that's a really interesting way to kind of look at and dig a little bit deeper. Let's jump ahead. I want to go back into kind of the Linux security, the security monitoring, and then what does it look like to go deeper into security analytics. We can look at a couple example queries that are tied to that. So, here we're looking and this is kind of a new format that we have within our new dashboards of saying, okay, let's just take a really simplified, almost minimalist Sparkline view here of like, what does it look like when we look at Linux security monitoring data and taking a more overview approach. Here we see successful logins, and it's kind of like a gradual downslope. And then we see failed logins. It's kind of an expected ratio. I mean, it's maybe a little bit high in this case of like 1900 to 8139. It's kind of like unexpectedly high number of failed logins, but not so far out of line of what threshold we'd sort of anticipate. And then we also see, it's interesting here because, when you think about like almost more of a DevOps perspective or site reliability engineering, you can see how there's more of like an administrative aspect of unexpected or expected attempts within sudo. So if this is telling us that this is a really high number, that may be that historically we only saw 500 attempts in a 60-minute span. That may be an indicator of like a brute force attack or just really some bad actor trying to take action on a system. And as we know, I think anyone on this call is probably aware that someone having access to sudo in particular is going to be a really sort of tricky scenario where they have access to a lot more resources than they would otherwise in a different kind of attack. So just one consideration from more of a security monitoring overview perspective. In terms of security analytics and kind of the going deeper that is involved with all of this, I think, as I mentioned, I mean, the ability to really dig in deeper and get more specific and get almost into like these set of lists that are indicating to us what's really occurring, I think can be a really helpful way to dig in and better understand kind of what is happening within your system. In this particular case, we have sudo attempts and sudo failures. This ratio actually, if you compare it, and it actually kind of makes sense if you think about it, of 1900 failures for the broader view versus 8139 logins. So this is just logins into a Linux operating system. This is a much higher ratio of failed logins versus the 509 failures to 81,000 attempts for sudo. So if you compare the two, it actually kind of makes sense, because if it's sort of like an everyday end user and they just have their device and maybe they're sort of fat fingering the password, this actually is pretty logical. Whereas, additionally, we're not so thrown off if we see like a much lower ratio for sudo, because most likely it's kind of like a more experienced user, or it's even just happening somehow behind the scenes with a cron job with a lot of logins happening continuously. So again, not out of the realm that this would occur, that we'd see like this much lower ratio of failures. But that being said, if you do want to kind of dig into the attempts and the various kind of spikes in behavior within those attempts, this is where we can see the outliers within this panel are actually indicating to us where the outliers are. So here the threshold is being crossed on the low end, actually. So it's a lower number of attempts, maybe indicating lower level of activity. So in this case, actually, the query probably should be tuned to only look at upper threshold, not lower, because a fewer number of attempted logins is probably not like a red flag that really warrants any concern. But just from an outlier perspective, I think it can be helpful to look at the underlying query here. So we see that the source category, as expected, is calling Linux data, and it's sort of it's wildcarded on all Linux data. So it's really going to capture a pretty wide, it's capturing a wide set or a wide swath of data. And then we're looking as a keyword, we're looking at pseudo as an indicator here. And then we're parsing out all of the kind of fields that are most relevant, extracting out also what fields are going to be most relevant. Both of these are done with a no drop, which means that we're not going to drop off any fields if they're empty. And then we go and we continue down, and there are a couple of kind of qualifiers here, right? So we're saying only when the process is pseudo, and only where the source user matches. Here it's wildcarded, but it's very intentionally set up to where if you wanted to set up a granular query, you could do that and say, okay, let's actually be specific and only limit it to like a whitelisted set of IPs. And the time slice is set to 15 minutes. The beauty of a time slice is it's kind of if it's too long of a time slice, then you're kind of it's painting too broad of strokes about that data. If it's too narrow, then it's not really going to be able to generalize the data very well. So here we have it set to 15 minutes, which for a in the moment attack is a very kind of helpful time period, because then you can kind of really pinpoint what's occurring without getting too lost in the details. And then, yeah, just more administrative piece, but just counting as event count within by time slice. So we're kind of breaking it down there. And then we're setting up the outlier to be the event count. So again, this is kind of an interesting situation where we get some outliers coming in, but they're not necessarily the most helpful, right? Because it's at the low end. And so we don't only want to really capture or keep an eye out for situations where that outlier is really a much higher threshold. We could actually check, I mean, just more curiosity at this point, we can even adjust the time period and see if we can get some kind of upper limits on that. So yeah, here we get various upper limits within the last 7 days that are indicating an increase in the number of attempted outliers. So cool. So yeah, it took a little bit different approach. I don't know if anyone here has been on previous webinars for cloud security monitoring and analytics. Today was a little bit more focused, I'd say, on the security analytics side of house, of getting really detailed and specific with tracking down, investigating, better understanding that kind of needle in a haystack, and being specific about the IPs and the users and the time slices that you're adjusting in order to get to a better understanding of what's occurring within your system. So definitely hope that was relevant to what you're looking to learn. I'm super excited to have you all join for future webinars as well, or focused around like Cloud SIM, or for more on like the application observability side of house as well. I'll pop back into a couple slides just to close things out. So as I mentioned, these are kind of various security monitoring dashboards that are available within either the app catalog or from a professional services team for kind of more one-off engagements. So you have the option of seeing more of like an overarching view of your AWS security data. You also have vulnerabilities. So like more of we call it like executive, but so it'd be like a VP of security engineering maybe, or a chief security officer that wants kind of like the broader strokes view of what's occurring in their system. And they want it over like a larger time period, most likely of 30 days. And that gives you that bigger stroke, bigger length of time to have like the broader strokes view of what's going on. Malware outbreak queries and dashboards. In the past, we've had like, I've focused this dashboard a little bit more on like the malware side of house. And I think that can be a really helpful way to tune accordingly to what types of malware you're looking to react to, and also have like a set of steps of remediation in place for that. SOC APIs is, again, probably a little bit more of like a management view here, but it can be helpful if you're thinking about like what the time to remediation is, or how do I actually investigate, or how do I assess whether investigation is occurring within a reasonable amount of time, and how do I make sure that that's actually being tuned in a way that the team is improving on more of a continuous basis. Investigation response, I actually showed the screenshot of already, so you should have some context there. And then Azure audit would be just another example of the user activity dashboard that I demoed in using Okta data previously within today's demo. So yeah, in the chat, you can see there's a couple of resources that you can dig into. The security analytics overview gives you kind of the, I guess, yeah, I mean, similar to what I've described today, but in text form and more kind of shareable, more referenceable. Demo video and run through is similar to what I've shown today, but very compressed into like 3 or 4 minutes. Security intelligence with Sumo, we actually have kind of a, so it's kind of looking at the broader view of the larger portfolio, and then security analytics brief. So in PDF format, if you want to have that more like shareable out to your team. We also have like a community Slack, which I find really helpful. I think our customers have found really helpful for just keeping almost like that boots on the ground knowledge of what's happening in more of like a, okay, we've rolled out this dashboard. It's brand new to Sumo. Sumo just rolled it out for its customers. What are some interesting things you're working on? Or like, what's a specific query that you need for this particular use case? You can just throw the question out to the community. Oftentimes, the Sumo employee will reply, but it may also be that a community member is aware of kind of how to react to that. So with that, I just want to say thanks so much for joining today's session. I'm going to stay on the line for another couple minutes. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I have my email there listed, jdunne@sumologic.com. My name is Jason, which I actually realized I didn't even intro myself, but Jason Dunne, and I'm a product marketing manager here at Sumo Logic. And if you want to go ahead and start a free trial today, the URL is sumologic.com/sign-up. So I'll actually just pop that into the chat now. Hosts and panelists. Okay. Yeah, so cool. So yeah, that's my email listed there in the chat. Reach out to sales if you have questions that are more kind of like, hey, I want to kickstart the process and really dig into whether it's a free trial or just sign me up. I love what Jason showed me today. It could be the case, but you know, in either event, we'll point you in the right direction. Definitely reach out to me as well if like you have a question about the Linux security monitoring dashboard and how to, you know, what that particular panel was, how it was constructed, and how it can be utilized in other dashboards. Like, I'm more than happy to help out from that perspective. So I know we had a couple questions come in ahead of time, which I think primarily the question that stood out to me was around response, which was kind of covered throughout the scope of today's session as to kind of like how incident response can be utilized within, or can be executed within cloud security monitoring platform versus how do you leverage Cloud SIEM or Cloud SOAR, which would be addressed in a future webinar. So was happy to kind of cover that in a sense within the scope of the presentation. But yeah, folks have any other questions, I'll stay on the line for another minute or two. And if not, I'll kind of call things here, and really appreciate folks joining today. Looking forward to having you in the next couple of webinars for the rest of the week as well.